Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize beforehand for reading my text, but before such august company, I don't dare to deviate very much from what I prepared beforehand. And in the end, I think you'll be thankful that I didn't. I've entitled my remarks, "The One and the Many," Unity, Diversity, and the Common Good. And I'll try to comment on these different points, all in relation to this fundamental tension that exists. There is perhaps no older nor more enduring philosophical problem than the problem of the one and the many. Whether we're talking about Milesian speculation about first matter, a single sort of stuff from which all else emerges, or about the controversies between Heraclitus's world in flux and Parmenides' unity of all things, problems of change and permanence, diversity and unity dominate philosophy in the Western world from the outset. Yet tensions between the one and the many are not restricted to the domain of metaphysical speculation. Many of today's most heated controversies whirl around these very tensions. How do we achieve unity in the midst of multiplicity? Which should take precedence? By what criteria and on what grounds should one be sacrificed to the other? How can harmony be achieved between them, and in what does this harmony consist? So we have, on the one hand, political correctness, which seeks to rein in cultural heterodoxies and achieve a certain unity of language and mindset. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, exerts a centrifugal force that celebrates diversity in its manifold expressions. Examples of these tensions abound, even in theological circles. You remember that in 2001, Cardinals Joseph Ratzinger and Walter Casper famously faced off in opposing articles in America magazine on the question of the relationship between the universal church and local churches. Casper gave predominance to the particular churches, saying that, quote, "the one church of Jesus Christ exists in and from the local churches." And in his response, Ratzinger contended that the universal church enjoys an ontological and temporal precedence vis-a-vis local churches. Alongside the ecclesiological tensions between the one and the many, we find further tensions between the unity of the faith and the plurality of theologies. In its 1990 instruction on the ecclesial vocation of the theologian, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith declared the freedom proper to theological research is exercised within the Church's one faith. We could continue to cite intra-ecclesial examples of tensions between the one and the many. For example, in the area of soteriology, think of Dominus Jesus, or the Congregation's response to Jacques Dupuis toward a Christian theology of religious pluralism. Or the case of liturgy, think of the question of inculturation versus the universality of the one liturgy. Or even moral theology, think of the virulent responses to John Paul II's 1993 encyclical letter Veritatis Splendor. But these will have to suffice for the moment. We must now turn our attention to the relationship between the one and the many in the free society. Striking the correct balance between the two, and indeed correctly positing the nature of their relationship, is essential to the right ordering of human society. At the socio-political level, the two extreme positions regarding the one and the many generally go by the names of individualism and collectivism. Individualism would refer to a social theory emphasizing the liberty, rights, and independent action of the individual, whereas collectivism would refer to the socialist principle of control by the people collectively, or the state, of all means of production or economic activity. Our generation instinctively rejects any attempts at homogenization and recoils from anything that resembles walking in mindless lockstep. Diversity is not only recognized, but celebrated and promoted. At the same time, people recognize a need for universal principles or common values that would serve as moral glue to cement a group of individuals into a true human community and protect minorities from the hegemony of the many. In a 1961 essay, Karl Wojtyła characterized these two extremes in the following way, quote, "On the one hand, persons may easily place their own individual good above the common good of the collectivity, attempting to subordinate the collectivity to themselves and use it for their own individual good. This is the era of individualism, which gave rise to liberalism in modern history and to capitalism and economics. On the other hand, society, in aiming at the alleged good of the whole, may attempt to subordinate persons to itself in such a way that the true good of persons is excluded, and they themselves fall prey to the collectivity. This is the error of totalitarianism, which in modern times has borne the worst possible fruit." End quote. Now, some would assert that the very nature of a free society, the topic of today's conference, would favor individualism over collectivism. Where socialist collectivism restricts the freedom of its citizens, liberal individualism would seem to guarantee it. Actually, the solution proposed by Pope John Paul II in Centesimus Annus is more subtle, and to my mind, more satisfying than this. In Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul begins the 5th chapter on state and culture with praise of the rule of law, where law is sovereign and not, quote, "the arbitrary will of individuals." He contrasts an organization of the free society with a balance of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, with different forms of totalitarianism, specifically mentioning Marxist-Leninism, where some arrogate to themselves the exercise of absolute power over the rest. Up to here, his analysis is fairly standard and would garner a broad consensus. It's the statement that follows that departs from conventional wisdom. John Paul affirms that the real difference between totalitarianism and democracy, based on a rule of law, is not so much the concentration of power into a single individual or party versus a system of checks and balances that broadens the base of power, but rather the more fundamental understanding of truth and the common good. Totalitarianism is based on voluntarism, or the supremacy of the will over reason, whereas a rule of law places will at the service of reason. According to John Paul, quote, "Totalitarianism arises out of a denial of truth in the objective sense. If there is no transcendent truth, in obedience to which man achieves his full identity, then there is no sure principle for guaranteeing just relations between people." End quote. The rule of political expediency is characteristic, in fact, of a totalitarian state. The breakdown of moral absolutes is necessary to permit such a state the free exercise of statecraft with no accountability to transcendent principles. The will of the ruler becomes the sole criterion of moral good and evil. Now, and note that the will of the ruler, this ruler can be a single individual or a party or simply the majority of the citizenry. Thus, John Paul wrote that the state, quote, "which sets itself above all values, cannot tolerate the affirmation of an objective criterion of good and evil beyond the will of those in power, since such a criterion in given circumstances could be used to judge their actions." The consequent evil of such a political system is that it denies the existence of a transcendent point of reference outside of the will of individuals, by which to guarantee and indeed understand just relations between people and the just order of society. The denial of objective truth importantly entails, quote, "the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person as the visible image of the invisible God, who is therefore by his very nature the subject of rights which no one may violate, no individual, group, class, nation, or state." Therefore, the true benefit of a political order based on a rule of law does not stem merely from a balance of powers and the consequent balance of opposing personal interests. The real superiority of such a system is its implicit or explicit recognition that objective principles of justice exist outside of the system itself, in which the system itself serves to advance. The division of political powers exists not merely to assure a system of checks and balances on personal will and self-interest, but in order to achieve justice and the common good. Here, will is subject to reason, and not vice versa. It is only in this light that we can understand John Paul's oft-cited remark, which comes a little further along in Centesimus Annus, which says a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. This is not an exercise in rhetoric for dramatic effect. Though democracy may seem to be the antithesis of totalitarianism, since it distributes political power evenly among the citizenry, if it fails to recognize objective truth and goodness beyond political expediency, it literally falls into the same error found at the heart of totalitarianism. It denies the role of reason in the organization of society and allows free rein to the will. If one does not acknowledge transcendent truth, John Paul continues, then the force of power takes over, and each person tends to make full use of the means at his disposal in order to impose his own interests or his own opinion, with no regard for the rights of others. People are then respected only to the extent that they can be exploited for selfish ends. In other words, when the Arthurian might for right falls back into the barbaric might makes right, the result is totalitarianism. Later on in his 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, John Paul drew out the practical consequences of such a transition, especially as regards the right to life. Quote, "This is what is happening also at the level of politics and government. The original and inalienable right to life is questioned or denied at the basis of a parliamentary vote, or the will of one part of the people, even if it is the majority. This is the sinister result of a relativism which reigns unopposed. The right ceases to be such, because it is no longer firmly founded on the inviolable dignity of the person, but is made subject to the will of the stronger part. In this way, democracy, contradicting its own principles, effectively moves toward a form of totalitarianism. The state is no longer the common home where all can live together on the basis of principles of fundamental equality, but is transformed into a tyrant state." End quote. And here we come to the central principle of the common good. It's an established principle of Catholic social thought that the state or political authority exists to promote the common good of society. This is its sole raison d'etre. Yet here differing notions of the common good will yield radically different conclusions regarding the nature and role of the state. A first view of the common good as the good of the collectivity, as we have seen in 20th century totalitarianism, is unacceptable on several grounds. The individual is subsumed into the whole and has value only in relation to the state. Even if Marxist communism had worked on the economic level, for example, it would have been a Pyrrhic victory, a state that functions perfectly as a Swiss watch, but whose members are reduced to the role of pieces of that watch, does not yield a truly human society at all. Society has no intrinsic value apart from its members, and the good of a society must always be evaluated by the good not only of the whole, but of the parts as well. Secondly, if on the other hand the common good is viewed through a utilitarian optic as the greatest pleasure, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, then it is likewise difficult to see how the totalitarianism spoken of by Pope John Paul can be avoided. This is the real danger of modern democracies with an underlying individualistic ethic. A calculus of maximizing happiness, where each member of society is assigned a value of 1, permits and even encourages the sacrifice of the minority for the majority. The maximization of happiness often demands this. Where 1 must be shot in order to save 100, a utilitarian ethic doesn't think twice about shooting the 1. There are no moral absolutes in utilitarian ethics, since the moral choice will always reflect a cost-benefit analysis, and any cost can be justified by benefits. The flaws of utilitarianism are compounded when the good of the greatest number is reduced to personal autonomy, rather than a more substantive idea of human flourishing. And this brings us to the definition of the common good offered by the Second Vatican Council, and subsequently appropriated by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which, while manifesting a prima facie poverty in its formulation, in reality proves exceptionally useful. The Council described the common good as, quote, "the sum total of social conditions which allow people, as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily." Note well that the common good, tutored by the public authority, does not describe a final outcome of human flourishing, since this can never be achieved by the state, but rather a culture or social environment that propitiates human flourishing. Certain social conditions are necessary so that men and women can freely and responsibly achieve their own fulfillment in cooperation with others. Human flourishing can never be imposed from without, since by its very nature it must be the result of free action. At the same time, this set of social conditions reflects a substantive idea of human nature and the common good, and is not a mere expression of consensus or convention. It is human reason that recognizes the requirements of the common good, rather than the human will arbitrarily imposing them. The protection of human freedoms, the satisfaction of human needs and rights, and the stability and security of a just social order give the common good a solid foundation of non-negotiable human goods. This vital environment is, or should be, the aim of political structures and policies. The explicit recognition of the elements of this environment is necessary for the free society. It was again in his 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae where John Paul articulated this important statement. It is therefore, quote, urgently necessary for the future of society and the development of a sound democracy to rediscover those essential and innate human and moral values which flow from the very truth of the human being and express and safeguard the dignity of the person. Values which no individual, no majority, and no state can ever create, modify, or destroy, but must only acknowledge, respect, and promote. There is a valid and necessary diversity within the common good, but there is also a diversity that threatens the foundation of the common good. Diversity is not to be celebrated for its own sake, but inasmuch as it contributes to the common good. Recognition of a basic core of moral truths is essential for the establishment and permanence of a free society. Justice, equality, and human dignity must be recognized as human truths rather than mere expedient conventions in order for the free society to truly be so. It's in this context that John Paul's personalism proves especially illuminating for the problem of the one and the many. It attempts to reconcile the errors of collectivism and those of individualism through a more robust understanding of the common good. In the first place, it posits a hierarchy or ordering of what is particular to what is common. We Americans appreciate that our national motto is e pluribus unum rather than ex uno plures. The goal is not diversity, but unity from diversity. At the same time, personalism does not allow the individual to be completely subsumed or subordinated into the whole. On the contrary, through a correct understanding of the dignity and rights of the person, moral absolutes become possible once again, when the inviolability of the individual is at stake. And I quote again from Karl Wojtyła's 1961 essay entitled Thomistic Personalism, where he says the following: Thomistic personalism maintains that the individual good of persons should be by nature subordinate to the common good, at which the collectivity or society aims. But this subordination may, under no circumstances, devalue the persons themselves. There are certain rights that every society must guarantee to persons, for without these rights, the life and development of persons is impossible. One of these basic rights is the right to freedom of conscience. This right is always violated by so-called objective totalitarianism, which holds that the human person should be completely subordinate to society in all things. In contrast, Thomistic personalism maintains that the person should be subordinate to society in all that is indispensable for the realization of the common good, but that the true common good never threatens the good of the person, even though it may demand considerable sacrifice of a person. End quote. Personalism's understanding of the common good derives from its understanding of the person himself. The inherent dignity of the person demands that persons always be treated as ends rather than means, loved rather than used. This principle has profound consequences for political ethics and the organization of society, since it prohibits the absolute subordination of the individual to the collectivity and demands respect for the inviolability and hence the radical equality of all persons. Again, note well that the common good does not stand in opposition to the particular good of persons, but rather comprises it, as well as the good of families and other mediating social institutions and associations. Since it is not identified with the good of the abstract collectivity, the common good is truly the good of one and all. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states, the common good is always oriented toward the progress of persons. The order of things must be subordinate to the order of persons and not the other way around. The Catechism, in fact, places respect for each and every person at the heart of the content of the common good. It states the common good presupposes respect for the person as such. In the name of the common good, public authorities are bound to respect the fundamental and inalienable rights of the human person. Society should permit each of its members to fulfill his vocation, and in particular the common good resides in the conditions for the exercise of the natural freedoms indispensable for the development of the human vocation, such as, and lists several rights. In this way, too, we see how the social principle of solidarity is a requirement of the common good and not a counterbalance to it. Although subsidiarity is fundamentally a limiting principle on the interference of a society of a higher order in the life of a society of a lower order, it is not meant to advance individualism over the common good. On the contrary, it is meant to further the common good, since the common good itself entails the good of persons and societies of all levels. In order to achieve the vital humus necessary for human flourishing, societies of a higher order must respect societies of a lower order and allow them the necessary autonomy for the responsible exercise of their proper competencies. Again, this is a component of the common good rather than a concession or counterweight. At the same time, personalism remedies the excesses of individualism as well. It offers a deeper explanation of the relationship between the particular good of individuals and the common good. Though the ordering of what is particular to what is common may seem to place the person on an inferior status vis-a-vis the community, this is not true. Attention to the common good, far from destroying the particular good of persons, is essential to it. Just as the common good necessarily comprises the particular good of persons, so too the particular good necessarily is achieved through attention to the common good. Herein lies the logic of the Second Vatican Council in saying that man is in fact the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, and at the same time that man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of self. In the words of Pope John Paul, these two aspects, self-affirmation and the sincere gift of self, quote, not only do not exclude each other, they mutually confirm and complete each other. Man affirms himself most completely by giving of himself. End quote. In other words, the good of the human person is found not in self-interest, but in self-giving. In serving the common good, the human person grows in his personal good as well as serving the achievement of the common good. This is why the Christian virtue of solidarity, described by Pope John Paul as a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, is necessary for human flourishing. In the end, the human person realizes his full potential only by going beyond himself and by serving the good of others. By asking human beings to look beyond themselves to the common good, above personal self-interest, society elevates its members and indicates to them the path to authentic fulfillment. In the end, the proposal offered by Christian personalism is a Trinitarian solution. It understands the mutual self-giving manifested in the inner life of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as a paradigm for human society. Made in the image and likeness of the Trinitarian Godhead, man is called to communion and to self-giving. And at the same time, the more lofty theological truths underlying a Christian notion of the common good do not obviate the need for a realism based on another theological truth, that of original sin. Man's tendency to selfishness must be curbed by social and political structures that both educate in virtue and restrain vice. Here, too, the reason for the Church's insistence on human rights. We've seen that in his reflections on the common good, John Paul granted special attention to human rights. Human rights prove uniquely useful in addressing the problem of the one and the many, in that they lay claim to a universality that unites the human race, while simultaneously according a moral absoluteness and inviolability to the individual. Despite a fair amount of opposition, the Church has consistently supported the United Nations in its articulation of universal human rights. As we've seen above, rights make a statement about objective human goods, and thus counter the voluntarism present in totalitarianism. When the United Nations endeavors to spread the idea that every human person possesses an inherent dignity, that women possess the same fundamental rights as men, that certain ways of treating children are always and everywhere wrong, it is proclaiming the existence of universal moral truths. Where these human rights are violated, contemporary society rightly denounces them as contrary to morality. The moral realism implicit in human rights stands in contrast to the moral or cultural relativism that threatens democracies today. In 1947, to just take one example, on the occasion of the United Nations debate about universal human rights, the Executive Board of the American Anthropological Association issued a statement in opposition to the United Nations' attempt to formulate a universal declaration of human rights. Written by leading members of the American Anthropological Association, the statement argued that individual cultures and societies must be evaluated on their own terms and not by universal standards. Quote, how can the proposed declaration be applicable to all human beings and not be a statement of rights conceived only in terms of the values prevalent in the countries of Western Europe and America, end quote. The statement added that, quote, standards and values are relative to the culture from which they derive, and what is held to be a human right in one society may be regarded as antisocial by another people. For those who see morality as a question of cultural convention, One moral code is no better than another, any more than driving on the right side of the road in America or Italy is better than driving on the left in England or Ireland. We may prefer one way to another, but it is not morally superior to the other. When rights are deemed to be partisan or simply cultural constructs, the possibility of a rule of moral reason becomes impossible, and the only remaining option is the balance of individual wills and power. In its more radical forms, multiculturalism undermines the conditions necessary for the common good, since it, like totalitarianism, denies the existence of universal moral truths. A contemporary example of this logic can be found in a recent statement of presidential candidate Rudy Giuliani, who said on April 5th, "I'm in the same position now that I was 12 years ago when I ran for mayor, or as mayor, which is personally opposed to abortion, don't like it, hate it, would advise that women don't have an abortion, but rather adopt, and I will help you find the money for it. But it's your choice. It's an individual right. You get to make that choice." Former New York Governor Mario Cuomo famously articulated and defended the same view in a speech at the University of Notre Dame in 1984, and recently revisited this theme speaking in Washington at a forum on politics and faith in America, where he said that holders of public office, including Catholic office holders, have a responsibility to create conditions under which all citizens are reasonably free to act according to their own religious beliefs, even when those acts conflict with Roman Catholic dogma regarding divorce, birth control, abortion, stem cell research, and even the existence of God, end quote. The reason I bring this up here as an example is its illustration of the same predominance of will over reason that we saw earlier. Arguments regarding abortion often are read as an attempt to impose one value system over another. In the above example, for instance, Giuliani is saying that opposition to abortion is a personal preference with no marker of objective truth to which one can appeal. In other words, moral principles flow from personal opinion or religious dogma, but not from reason. And that's why opposition to abortion is immediately understood as an imposition of personal values on others. In the end, Catholic social doctrine, and Centesimus Annus in particular, offers a refreshing and satisfying alternative to Enlightenment theories regarding public authority and the common good. For a free society to remain so, a voluntaristic understanding of the common good must give way to a rediscovery and recognition of objective moral truth that lies necessarily at its base. Thank you.